U.S. elections, 4 days away. We will talk to one of the leading voices of liberal America, Rachel Maddow. And a lot is happening in the region. Will Iran retaliate for Israel's attack? Is a deal between Israel and Hezbollah and a deal between Israel and Hamas within reach? What's next for humanitarian aid in Gaza? And why are there writers who think that boycotting other writers will solve anything in this mad world? Yes, we're Jews. There are more questions than answers. I'm Yonit Levy of Channel 12 in Tel Aviv.
And I'm Jonathan Friedland of The Guardian in London. Unholy, 2 Jews on the news, as you say, lots of Jews, lots of questions, and lots of news. Oh my word! I mean, we've said this perennially, this last year especially, but we're really, at the business end of a US election, and I think there was, I'm going to call it not an assumption, but a hope that things might quieten down because of that. But on the contrary, all of the Middle East stuff is still very, very hot. Since we've last spoke, and we'd always talked about, there's so much, we could list how much, but one of the big ones is obviously, because we talked about it in anticipation for so long, Israel's response to the October the 1st Iranian barrage of ballistic missiles. And last weekend it finally came.
Listen, the news is so intense that what happened, this retaliatory attack that we have been anticipating, happened 6 days ago. And it looks like it's a little bit old news now. How that's how mad this world is. So yes, let's, I was on air for 7 hours. Let's at least summarize it in 7 sentences, what happened on that night. Israel has never attempted to do something as complex as that night of attacks on Iran. Unprecedented, following, of course, unprecedented attacks by Iran against Israel twice, on April and on October 1st, as you said, Jonathan. So first of all, Israel attacking aerial defenses in Iran, also attacking or damaging severely Iran's surface-to-air missile deployment. And also the drone production has been disrupted. Also a term that we have become accustomed to or learned about in the last week, at least people who weren't well-versed in the Iranian story. The planetary mixers, those components that are crucial for the fuel of ballistic missiles, also those have been destroyed, 12 of them, according to reports. And this has been very successful for Israel. It has refrained from the 2 promises it made to the Biden administration: no nuclear sites and no oil fields. That is, of course, targeting oil fields in the week running up to the American elections is a very, risky thing to do. That is where we are at this point. And now the question, or the ball rather, returning to the Iranian side in this story, will they indeed retaliate? There are questions about this. Do they have a deniability area in which they can say, you know what, nothing too dramatic happened and we can continue with our lives? Or does it have to respond to what Israel did? And that opens up a whole different game from now on.
So just a couple of things to say about this. One is that in our anticipatory conversations, there was a whole range of questions about how intense this reaction would be, this response would be. Would Israel go, as some in Israel were pushing all the way, as you said, hit the nuclear sites was really the ultimate one. Plenty of people saying this is a rare opening, a rare opportunity when Israel would have, as it were, right on its side, responding to an attack, defending itself, that it could hit those nuclear targets. In the end, it was such a sort of calibrated response. At first blush, it looked as if Israel had gone right to the other end of the spectrum, the sort of quieter end of the spectrum. At first glance, it looked like that. Now that you look back, you realize actually it achieved a huge amount, which goes to the question of what Iran does next. Because, and I'm quoting here, a US official, Amos Hochstein, President Joe Biden's representative, talks with the other front, Lebanon, saying that Iran has been left essentially naked. It's an essentially naked target. What does he mean by that? Everything you were just saying, it's been stripped of its air defenses. It means that, if they want to hit Israel back for this, in this kind of tit-for-tat rounds that we're talking about, then Israel can hit them back pretty well anywhere because they've been stripped of the defenses they would otherwise have had. So on that level, you have to say, it may have looked less kinetic than other options that were available, But it wasn't just a slap on the wrist. It actually seems to have achieved something militarily that is quite substantive and will go to this calculation. So I think we're back to Iran thinking when it wants to hit Israel, it will go to its preferred mode, which is, let other people do the dying. It will send in or deploy its proxies, and always been its preferred method over decades. Those are themselves, as we'll come on to talk about, in a much more parlous state than they were before.
Yeah, I mean, and also there's the issue of timing. We are a few days before an American election. There will then be an interregnum period in which Biden is still the president and not yet a new president inaugurated. So if Israel were to say, the main target should be nuclear sites, that's a much more complicated operation. It needs a tight American cooperation. What president would do that? I don't think that is something we can look at in the next couple of weeks before there's a new president in the White House, and perhaps not after. Both have said, either in their own voice or through the voice of their other surrogates, both Trump and Harris don't seem to be interested in a full-out war between Israel and Iran.
And the word nuclear is going to spook any incoming president. That's not what anyone wants in their in-tray, either arriving in or returning to. In some ways, both of them could be described that way, but to the White House. That remains sort of on hold or in suspended animation. But I think the calculus is very, very different now than it would have been before, not least for the Iranians. I mentioned that their preferred method is to go through a proxy. Their strongest proxy was always Hezbollah to Israel's north in Lebanon. And the talk this week back and forth has been of, again, more sort of sunny talk from the White House, partly because they would love something like this before Election Day, a diplomatic achievement, but some talk of, a pause, an end to the fighting there, with Israeli military officials at least saying they have more or less achieved what they want to achieve. They're ready to wind it up, to end their military operations there. And similar noise is definitely coming out of the Lebanese government, but maybe even out of Hezbollah itself. What's your sense of that one? Are people optimistic where you are, or we've learnt a long time ago not to ever feel optimistic about anything?
I mean, look, we're at a point where we need to zoom out and ask. The fact that Israel has had successes in relation to Iran, a lot of success in Lebanon, has been pounding Hamas for a year. Is it a point in which Israel stops and says, let's indeed reach a deal between Israel and Hezbollah and between Israel and Hamas? The former has more chances than the latter. As you said, a sort of concentrated effort made by the Biden administration, top envoys in the region, Amos Hochstein and Brett McGurk, are here and trying to hash out this deal, which will look a lot like the 1701 deal after the Second Lebanon War in 2006, essentially saying Hezbollah has to pull back, withdraw its forces from behind the Litani River. At some points, that is about 30 kilometers from the border with Israel. Other points, it's closer. But essentially to say, you need to back off. We'll remind our listeners, Hezbollah was violating this agreement, thus the latest skirmish in the past year. The chances for that look pretty good on both sides. First of all, Israel perhaps thinking we had a lot of successes and doesn't want to be bogged down by a winter war with Hezbollah. Obviously, Hezbollah suffering a lot of hits from Israel. The only question here, and the main key, is what is the mechanism you have to enforce this kind of deal? That is the key clause. And if that is something that Israel thinks that its security is protected, then it can go to that deal. And at least that front can be shut down. This is a month after Israel, I remind you, launched its ground offensive into Lebanon. That happened for the first time in 18 years. Talk about news that sort of flies by when you're dealing with other news. So that is where we are in that regard.
Yeah, I think we'll watch and wait. And somehow it will look different, I think, after Tuesday. Once we know,
the biggest question of the week resolved.
We may not know. In fact, most people, I think we won't know on Wednesday. But in the coming days and weeks, we'll have some clarity about America, the United States, and I think that will potentially unblock some of these things. But very, very interesting to know that that at least at the military level, that state of aware, on the Israel side has been reached. The thing that we have learned, though, is the extent to which the military often pulls in a direction saying, okay, we've achieved our objectives. We're ready now to bring this thing to a close, do a deal. That doesn't necessarily mean the political echelon follows. And we've seen that on the other front, and I'm talking about Gaza, where the military have been making noises for a long time, saying we are ready for a ceasefire deal designed to bring back some, at least, of Israel's hostages. The political branch, meaning Netanyahu really, and his enablers, Smotrich and Ben Gvir, the people who are sort of pulling him, they seem as reluctant as ever, especially perhaps this week, given some of the news.
Yes, I mean, notwithstanding the fact that October saw the killing of Sinwar and successes in Israel's war in Lebanon, and obviously the very precise attacks in Iran we mentioned, this has been a dark month. In fact, the darkest month since October 2023 in terms of Israeli casualties. In the sense that there have been 80 Israeli citizens and soldiers killed in terror attacks from missiles and in combat. That is the highest number, as I said, since October 2023. And what's interesting, really, and that it's intertwined with the political story here, right? The Knesset returns for its winter session after 3 months of a recess that the members of Knesset needed in the middle of a war. So the Knesset returns to its session. And you have, very interestingly, Jonathan, the religious Zionists in the Knesset being increasingly upset at the other side of the coalition, which is the ultra-Orthodox, for precisely the fact that they are not in any way taking part of this in this effort. Now, we will remind our listeners that the religious nationalists in Israel, let's say broadly speaking, representing the settler movement, are very much taking up the burden of the military alongside other secular Israelis. There have been many casualties from that group in Israel, to the extent that Bezalel Smotrich, one of the sort of representatives of that group in the Knesset, was crying this week in front of the cameras. He had been crying any day since October 7th, but this did make him break down. And so these are the people who combine Torah studies and military service. Many of them go into combat units. And when they see the other part of the coalition, the ultra-Orthodox, who are not doing this in mandatory service, that gets them, obviously is creates something of a rift between those two groups. So as I said, it was a pretty difficult week for Israelis. 23 soldiers dead, and most of them are reservists because the military needs 5,000 soldiers. It doesn't have them. More of the burden falls on the reservists. These are people who are older. They have families. That is just a statistic that came out this week. 56 children in Israel lost their father this week. So that is a number that Israelis have a hard time grasping. And we have been talking a lot about the draft bill, the fact that the ultra-Orthodox want an official exemption from military service. There have been all kinds of attempts to circumvent that. We've seen one of them this week that might work, but it's just kicking the problem down the road. It will not solve the problem for this coalition.
The issue we were talking about Haredi ultra-Orthodox enlistment, we've talked about it a lot. The assumption, I think, for many years was that this was an issue that pitted religious, broad category, against secular, broad category. That it was secular people who resented religious people for not serving. That was the sort of, crude description. What you've just said brings out, I think, a really important distinction between, religious who serve, religious Zionists, and ultra-Orthodox who don't. And it seems to me that might be the thing that ultimately unlocks this issue. That if it was merely religious versus secular, it was just going to go round and round and round as it has for many decades. But if the right itself is split on this issue, which it now very clearly is, that leaves the ultra-Orthodox parties, that community, much more isolated. And, it's not the main event of this long war. But if that is one of the sort of knock-on effects, the consequences of this war, that religious Zionist losses, deaths, make them impatient at ultra-Orthodox refusal to serve. And I direct people back to our episode that we recorded with Rivka Ravitz and the response it got from so many listeners of outrage, including religious listeners, who were outraged by her insistence that, no, we cannot send our boys to serve because they might come back no longer religious.
Changed. Yeah.
And people listening to that thought, well, that's competitive. They might not come back at all. That rift, it could be the one that ultimately unlocks this issue much more than just sort of, in the cliche, liberal, secular Tel Aviv residents who do all the fighting pitted against the religious blanket category. It's subtler than that, and it may actually mean that the issue unlocks.
In the meantime, the coalition is still on its feet, and the question, we talked about what the chances are for a Lebanese deal. The question now moves to the southern front. What is the question? What are the chances of a deal with Gaza? I mentioned the coalition because in that, Netanyahu's coalition is pretty much, steadfast against ending the war. Although, as you said, the IDF and the defense echelon has done anything it can publicly to say this is the time to go to a hostage deal and a ceasefire, which is the military's way of saying we have exhausted what we can do at this point in Gaza. There are 101 hostages still held by Hamas. The assessment of one of the people involved in the negotiations this week, I think it was published by our friend Amos Harel, is that every 10 days a hostage dies in captivity. It is very clear what the conditions there are. You had Mia Shem, one of the hostages that came back from captivity, saying she was locked in cages with 5 other female hostages. She returned after 54 days. They are there for almost 400. We don't need to have a very active imagination to understand the clock is ticking. This week there were some murmurs like we might move forward with this. There was a new summit in Doha, reigniting these talks. There was another attempt at an Egyptian, what was dubbed in Israeli media, the small deal, saying just release a handful of soldiers for 48 hours of a ceasefire, and maybe that can move things forward. As it stands, it seems two things. One, the Israeli coalition is not enthusiastic to go to this deal. And two, it is not entirely clear who in Hamas is calling the shots after Sinwar has been killed. Is it his brother in Gaza, Muhammad Sinwar, or is it the external sort of hierarchy of Hamas outside of Gaza? That is all, taking its toll, and we are beyond running out of time in that regard.
When Sinwar was killed, a lot of people thought, okay, now this must end the war, surely. That gives the victory picture to Netanyahu. That enables him to say, I've won. It gives him the off-ramp. He can then do this deal. I have to say, neither of us were optimistic on that score, but a lot of people around the world, and from what you're saying in Israel, thought, in a way, what was the point of killing Sinwar if you didn't use it to get this opening? It hasn't been seized. It does make you think, when you think that very stark number of one dying every 10 days, what more will it take? What more has to happen? Sinwar's there, the reality for the hostages. And the effect of this, I have to tell you, is to diminish, even among Israel's allies and friends, the sympathy for Israel's war, because people think, okay, we were ready to hold out until you got the symbol of Sinwar. But now that you have, what more is it you need to do? You're turning rubble into rubble, as Donald Rumsfeld famously said about Afghanistan. You're sort of running out of targets. You have pounded Gaza to such an extent. You've got the leader of Hamas. What more is there to do? And I think that points to two things, which obviously, were very, very big internationally this week. One is this, the conduct of what's happening in northern Gaza. I'm aware that it makes much more news outside Israel than inside, I think. But the sense that place is being starved out, that the so-called general's plan is being implemented in effect, if not officially, by the lack of aid going into northern Gaza and the evacuation of the population. And we talked about it last week, coming alongside talk of, resettling that area, the erasure, that's the word that's being used, of northern Gaza. And people are, on social media, aerial photographs showing the sort of emptying out of northern Gaza. That has people, if it wasn't for the American election, I think it would be the dominant thing around the world, the fear for what's happening there and the lack of sympathy for Israel there. And right related to that is the vote of the Knesset this week, Israel's parliament, to ban, in effect, break off all ties with UNRWA, the United Nations Relief and Works Agency, famously the only UN agency that exists for a specific people, that is dedicated to the Palestinian refugees and has been since 1948. That has prompted, something close to sort of mourning around the world, where people think that is curtains for Palestinians because aid organizations and others say that it is the only organization that brings in aid, that has, just even a very basic infrastructure and organization that can get aid to people in Gaza. That's how it's been received. Of course, what Israel says is, we can't work with this organization. We have shown that 9 UNRWA officials were among the perpetrators of the October 7th massacre. The response, and it obviously makes people's eyes roll from diplomats and others outside, is, 9 out of 13,000? It's not that many. And of course, Israel says, well, even just having one taints the whole of the organization. This is what's going back and forth. But it's having a very real impact because people think it's all but unprecedented to break off ties with a UN agency, and in humanitarian terms, they fear terribly what comes next for Palestinians if you do break off from this agency, which I know is reviled and hated in Israel by a massive consensus, hence a vote of 92-10. So that gap, long way of saying, the gap between Israel and the outside world on this war, wider still on this latest development.
I think that the outrage about this law drowned the reasons for it. You talk about, is it 7, is it 9? UNRWA has, and this is not in question, I think, in dispute, has been thoroughly infiltrated by Hamas. And that has been true for years. And their own employees were involved in the October 7th massacre. I don't think it matters if there were 9 or if there were more. That is the thing that is outrageous for many, many Israelis across the political spectrum. Israel's problem here is in the thinking ahead department. And that is the main question. Who will distribute food in Gaza if UNRWA is not there? And you can't have a knee-jerk policy here in this issue. It's too serious. If you only, ease immediate anger without thinking long-term, and let's say Israel's strong suit is never really, sadly, thinking long-term. Maybe this is the effects of a nation born in uncertainty and living through uncertainty in its entire life. It's saying, okay, tomorrow we'll take care of tomorrow. But these people need to be fed today. So that is the main question, really. Fine, you take away UNRWA. It is guilty in so many levels. Fine. But who's going to take that role? And moreover, I think, and you touched on that, it fuels the suspicions that the world has vis-a-vis this coalition. Because what you hear from people like Bezalel Smotrich, right, the far end of this coalition, is saying, you know what, we need to have military rule in Gaza, and the IDF should be distributing food. Military is saying, we don't want that role. Like, I don't want, the military doesn't want Israeli soldiers killed because they're trying to distribute food to people in Gaza. And does that military rule lead eventually to resettling Gaza with Israeli settlements? So again, this fuels these suspicions on what the real plans of the coalition are in relation to Gaza. And I'll just tie it back to the main question. Fine, you want to get rid of UNRWA. Personally, there are many Israelis who would think that is a good decision. But again, who is then going to distribute food to the people who need it in Gaza? That is the main question.
But it goes to the larger critique where I think we've aired a lot on the podcast over the last year, which is, what is the strategy? What is the day after? What is the plan? Gaza is next to you. It's not about to sort of drift off into the Mediterranean. It's there.
And it's not going to be ruled by the Swiss. Remember what Defense Minister Yoav Gallant said.
Yeah, but what is Israel's plan for it? And there never is a plan, and therefore you end up just going with what may be fine as a sort of op-ed column or a riff on Channel 14, but it's not a policy. And that's the problem. It goes to, though, it fuels the suspicions of those who have the darkest view of Israel around the world, who want to say, in common with the South African government at The Hague, that this is a genocide, that this is ethnic cleansing, that Gaza is being cleared of people. This sort of moves helps that case. And the reason why I mention all that is because of this move by a whole lot of writers, led by Sally Rooney, the Irish novelist, but Naomi Klein, a US writer, and a whole lot of others, have signed a full cultural boycott call, saying that they want to have nothing to do with Israeli cultural institutions that do not, and then there's a list of sort of bars that they have to clear. They must sever all ties and not with, Israel's apartheid, ethnic cleansing, colonial project or whatever. The document is riddled with this language of genocide and apartheid and so on. They must have been unable to believe their luck that their timing in launching this cultural cool boycott came just as these developments we're talking about. There has inevitably been a very swift reaction to it, and a whole lot of writers, many of the people who've been on this podcast before, Simon Sebag Montefiore and the great novelist Cynthia Ozick and Howard Jacobson, all kinds of people wrote a counter.
Sir Simon Schama. It really reads like a list of unholy interviewees, doesn't it?
It does. So Simon Schama are one of our most recent guests, all saying that they are against this. What's interesting is the best argument in terms of effectiveness against this boycott has not been to argue the merits and say, oh, Israel's war is great and it's completely, everything about it's wonderful. Rather to say, if you want to change things, if you are boycotting writers in Israel, you are boycotting the very people who are likely to make the case for change or be active for change. Do not silence the voices of peace. That was one of the sort of arguments in this counter boycott. I just think it's something interesting about how this argument plays out around the world, which is often the best method of persuasion is to point to those oppositional dissenting voices in Israel and say, do not isolate them.
I'd add to that the question, isn't a boycott like this the exact opposite of what literature should be? Literature is there to open your mind. It's there to make you think. It's there to take you to new worlds. The minute literature is only there to reinforce, it's not literature. It's George Orwell's Ministry of Truth. And look, I'll be the last person to say that criticism of Israel is anti-Semitism. I never thought that, and I never will. But criticism only of Israel very well might be. These people are not boycotting other nations, Russia, China, Iran, Syria. They're not marching for the Afghan women who really need all the help they can get. They're not marching for Uyghurs. They're not marching for minorities in Russia. It's only Israel that in their mind is the evil league of evil. So that is to me, nothing more than being two-faced. And I would want to read to you a quote of a good friend of mine and a friend of the pods, Mati Friedman, who wrote it this way. And I thought it was very poignant. He wrote, "It's a real comment on Western self-awareness that numerous intellectuals have come to hate the same people as their grandparents did and seem to earnestly believe it's a coincidence." End quote.
Yeah, I mean, Matthew Friedman, another person who had signed that counter letter and who's been a guest with us more than once. Yeah, that was the argument a lot of people made, that there are echoes of the anti-Jewish boycott of the Nazis in the 1930s, that once you start this, that you think you're boycotting Israel, but in effect, you're going to be boycotting, Jewish cultural expressions. I know that they would say to your list, yeah, but there aren't all the time huge cultural literary links with Russia and Syria and China and so on. And there were, and I deliberately use the past tense, with Israel. That would be their argument. And, they would say that, focus on the thing they're talking about. I think I'm with you on this, that it is exceptional and noticeable that this is the issue that gets a lot of these people out of bed in the morning in a way that other issues do not. We'll leave that there. The thing I would just mention is this is an explicit cultural boycott, a document signed and transparent. The phenomenon that troubles me a little bit more is a kind of quiet, below radar, unofficial cultural boycott. The director of the UK Jewish Film Festival wrote this week about how it sort of came public with how the event he organises every year around this time is struggling suddenly to get venues for films. And they would film Jewish films, they would film sometimes Israeli films, but sometimes films nothing to do with Israel. And they have noticed venues and cinemas suddenly saying, apologies, we're incredibly busy, so sorry, we haven't got time. He mentioned a cinema in Wales that didn't have time for a rare thing, a Welsh Jewish film. There's only a very small Jewish community in the country of Wales. And he, said, I'm going public with this. I wonder if that is a phenomenon around the world, which is people who don't want to do what Sally Rooney and others have done and be public and explicit about it, but instead a kind of quiet boycott, a sort of stealth boycott, below radar, unofficial. It means they don't have to take the heat. They're not going to get Simon Sebag, Montefiore, Matty Friedman on their case, because they can say, look, we just didn't have any space in our schedule. Not good if that's what's going on, and completely unacceptable if it's a boycott of Jewish cultural expression that has nothing to do with Israel. Then they, of course, are making their critics' case for them, because they are saying, in effect, not explicitly, this is a de facto boycott of Jewish culture.
An American election is right around the corner.
Really?
We have a great conversation. By the way, we should remind our listeners that we had a special episode midweek, the Great Jewish Debate between Dan Senor from the Republican side and Jeremy Bash from the Democratic side. We have been getting a lot of responses to that episode, trying to go in depth to that question of the two candidates, Israel, their policy towards the Middle East, Israel, and anti-Semitism. I thought it was a fascinating conversation, just to note that. And look, we have been covering, you and I, we both share this American political obsession. I think we've been covering every campaign since 1992, basically.
Yes. Although I don't know how you were doing that from your, infant
from my school newspaper. Really, I was,
precocious.
Young, precocious is the
precocious
word.
Talent.
Anyway, so that was that. And the last thing anyone would want to do is to make a prediction as we are standing on the cusp of the results. I have no idea who's going to win. The only gut feeling I have here is that we keep saying razor thin and a very tight election. I don't think the results are going to be tight. I think they're going to be decisive, and I think they're going to come in earlier than we think. Just the reason for saying that is because I've heard this whole sort of weeks leading up to the election is just how close it's going to be. I think there are groups that we don't understand how to poll and how to look at even. I don't know if that group is the young voters, first-time voters that might swing this election. I don't know if the group is the sort of Muslim Arab voters, which might swing this election. In that regard, I would want to point out, and we haven't talked about this enough, but that Mossad Bulus, the father-in-law of Tiffany Trump, is the new Jared Kushner. And you see that all the time. You see the Jared Kushner fading in the background. He wasn't at the Madison Square Garden. He might maybe become an envoy for the Saudis if indeed Trump is elected, but he's much less involved. And there's a lot of critique. He has a lot of criticism of what happened on January 6th. But you see Mossad Bulus stepping up, bringing Trump closer to the Muslim community in Michigan. That could be something that might sway voters. You see what Trump has been, posting on X. Right? Vote Trump for peace, and I will bring peace to the people of Lebanon and stop the war. I'm sure Netanyahu wasn't pleased to read that tweet. So there's so many moving parts here that I think it's going to be really, obviously I'm saying something so dumb here. It's going to be very interesting to analyze it right after the election.
No, I don't think that is dumb. I think there was I've been sort of harboring a very similar view and a pollster echoed this the other day. He said it's uncertain, which doesn't mean it's close. Look, it's obviously on one level close because all these polls show it within the margin of error in each state. But as you said, the polls could be missing something, and they have done. There have been these polling misses in the last few election cycles. It happened again in 2022, where everyone said, "Oh, a Republican red wave is coming." It didn't come. The question that I'm obsessed with, and we cannot know till it happens, is who is being undercounted. It's similar to what you said. If in 2022 it was women, straightforwardly, that they just had missed this degree of energy around the Dobbs decision overturning abortion rights. Could it be young men this time? In which case it would break for Trump, and it will, as you said, it may not be close. And a lot of people have thought, okay, there's 7 swing states. The idea it would be 4-3. No, it might be 7-0. It may be 6-1 or 5-2. It may not in the end be that close. Obviously, there are many ways to define close because you could win a big electoral college landslide, even if each of the individual swing states you win by a whisker. So it's a complicated thing. But I have wondered that if if when it's all said and done, we'll go, oh, actually, there was this very obvious shift and we just couldn't see it. And so we will have a clearer idea of that. But that's interesting because you're in a way suggesting we will know by Wednesday. So that's a bit of a prediction. And we'll obviously...
The most cautious prediction one could...
No, I don't think that is cautious because if we don't know by Wednesday, then it's a bit of a...
Yeah, then I'll bring this bit back and we'll laugh about how idiotic I sounded.
But I think underneath it is something very not idiotic. I think that is right, that there's something there. And the interesting thing is you can write that narrative for either, because it could be that the women of America have quietly decided they are no way having Trump as president again, and they're just going to quietly get on with it. And we'll see that on Wednesday morning. Or it could be that, of course, an incumbent administration with high inflation and a wrong track number of 20, it's only 20 odd percent, 23%, I think, who think the country's on the right track. Of course, they were going to throw out the incumbents and go for Donald Trump. So you can write either of those now.
Listeners, just like Boris Johnson prepared 2 columns for Brexit and against Brexit, Jonathan Friedland just told you how he can write the column before the elections of why Kamala Harris won and why Donald Trump won. That was nice. That was an exercise in column writing.
And in fact, that is actually the column I am planning for pre-election, which by the time some people listening to this may indeed already have appeared. I think it's fascinating what you said about the father-in-law and fascinating, and who would have thought it believable that the man Donald Trump, who was saying he wanted to have a Muslim ban, banning people from Muslim countries until we worked out what the hell is going on, he said in 2015, who would have thought that there is good evidence that Muslim voters in America are moving towards him? Extraordinary.
And that is very interesting for Israelis as well, because the poll that we published this week is talking about the hugest gap for Trump in Israel. That has all kinds of reasons. I think, if I'm not mistaken, it was 77% for Trump and 17% for Kamala Harris. That has all kinds of explanations. She is an unknown quantity here and others. But I mean, Wyoming didn't have those results, right, in 2020. The point is that I think Israelis haven't figured out yet that, again, the sort of go-to guy of the first Trump administration, Jared Kushner, is now much less in the picture, and Mossad Bulus is much more in the picture, and that will change. That might change Trump's policies.
Also out of the picture, by the way, Ivanka Trump. You don't really see her, Jared Kushner's wife, obviously. That number, by the way, of Israelis massively for Trump. If you wanted an illustration of how out of step Israel now is with the rest of the Western world, that number shows you. Yeah. There is not a country in Europe, apart from Russia, actually, where voters favour Trump over Harris. Everywhere else, they want Harris to win Trump, and yet Israel shows 77% for Donald Trump.
Just to explain the Israeli psyche on this, I would say that the Israelis look at, things like the Abraham Accords, things like moving the embassy to Jerusalem, being very, at least in rhetoric and in the assassination of Soleimani, being very tough on Iran. Those are the things Israelis are focusing on because we are quite self-involved, perhaps, and not on other things that worry different countries like the U.S. For example, what happened, on January 6th and questions about the strength of American democracy and what Trump is doing to it. So I think that explains a lot about the gap. But again, that is what it is.
If you did a survey of Jews outside Israel and outside the United States, I am absolutely sure the numbers would be massively against Donald Trump. Why? Because there is a historic fear about Donald Trump. He looks a little like people that we've encountered before in our history. Why do I say all that ahead of our special guest interview? It's because our guest this week is somebody who's done really important new work on America's past with fascism. And it has been groundbreaking and has got attention all over the world. She has a huge profile besides this new work, and we are delighted to have her once again on Unholy.
Rachel Maddow is the face of MSNBC and one of the most admired voices in American liberal journalism. Her new book, Prequel, An American Fight Against Fascism, and the 2 seasons of her podcast, Ultra, huge success. She tells the story hitherto all but unknown of a plot to subvert American democracy and institute fascism in the 1940s and suggests the message that story offers. For today, Rachel, thank you so much for talking to us again on Unholy.
I'm so happy to be here with you guys. We should do this more frequently than we do because I miss you when I don't talk with you.
We think so too. Last time was December of 2022, and so much has changed in the world. So
the whole world is in a different place. See, we need to do this more frequently, and then maybe we can keep the change at bay.
Perhaps that would be, we never tried that. So let's do that. Let's commit to doing that. I want to actually open up by quoting part of your prologue. And you say this in Prequel, in your new book. It says this: calculated efforts to undermine democracy, to foment a coup, to spread disinformation across the country, to overturn elections by force of arms with members of Congress helping and running interference. All these things add up to a terrible episode for a country like ours to live through, but they are not unprecedented. Our current American struggle along these lines, it turns out, has a prequel. And then you go into the very detailed and fascinating story that happens and begins in the 1940s. But we are talking now on the precipice of an American election. And I wonder, before we go into the details of this historic story, what you would want people to take from this book. What is the main link between then and now?
The reason I wrote the book actually started from a contemporaneous question. In 2017, when Trump and Trumpism sort of overtook the Republican Party, and then when he was elected, it was not surprising to see the radical restructuring of the Republican Party, sort of ideological resorting of what it meant to be a mainstream Republican. I also think it wasn't surprising to see the far right celebrate Trump and his rise. What was surprising to me was this big spike in something that I think of as existing outside those sort of electoral politics contours. And it was a big spike in Holocaust denial, which I think of as a very fringe thing, at least particularly in 2017, I thought of as a very fringe thing. And to me, it was as a correlation, I just didn't understand why they seemed to be rising in concert and why some of the worst people and the very farthest, not just right-wing fringes, but anti-Semitic and Holocaust-denying fringes of the American beyond the pale extremist edge, we're also celebrating this moment on the American electoral right. And so what I wanted to do was figure out the origins of American Holocaust denial. And I started working on that and was surprised to find that it existed even in the 1940s. If you think of Holocaust denial as a factually irrational thing, it's hard enough to grasp it now in the 2020s. But in the 1940s, while the ashes of Europe weren't yet cool, that was a strange time to already be denying that it was happening. And so I started to Once I think you can firmly dislocate the idea of Holocaust denial from any misapprehension of the facts, from any potentially good faith misunderstanding of what happened, and you start to realize it as a purely political thing, you can see why it was happening the way it was in 2017. And it led me to the story of what happened to that class of Americans in the 40s. And we had a big domestic fight against a very powerful, very well-connected pro-fascist, pro-Nazi movement in the United States in the 1940s. And that is good to know as our history. It's good to remember that we have had a recurring fight against movements like this in our country. And I think it's important to learn now because that side lost, broadly speaking, in the 1940s in the United States. And I think it's helpful for those of us who think of ourselves as anti-fascists today to know what tactics were effective against our forebears who were a similar kind of movement, I think, in the lead up to World War II.
See, I'm very interested in your comment there about it's good to know that there's something useful in this, because I think you can go one of two ways with this notion of a prequel, which is you can either find it reassuring that the Republic went through this and came out the other side, survived it, or you can be alarmed by the idea that there is this streak. You talk about it in the 40s in the book, in your new season of Ultra. It's there again in the 50s. It's right into the United States Senate. That takes you to the idea that there's this recurring motif in American politics, this strain in American political life. And that if anything, maybe the aberration is when America isn't dealing with that. There is this pattern that eventually is going to sort of, we're not going to keep getting lucky, that one day it's going to prevail. And that's a much bleaker view. But I think, they're both there in the story. And that's what sort of makes it so stimulating, I think. But where do you go with it? Are you reassured by it, or are you unnerved by it?
Yes. The glass is half. The secret of that metaphor, right, is that the glass is both half empty and half full at the same time, and both are equally true. And for me, thinking about this just tactically and strategically in terms of Americans who are trying to, and actually people around the world who are trying to resist and fight and ultimately defeat this rising tide of authoritarianism that so many countries are dealing with right now, it functions at a couple of different levels. I mean, one is that, by diagnosing why the surprisingly large fascist movement in the United States in 1940 didn't succeed, is to understand what were its strengths and weaknesses. And that helps us identify strengths and weaknesses today. I do think, for example, tactically today, it's really important to recognize that we've never before had an authoritarian-minded movement that both had an effective, charismatic, single leader and was linked to, and in fact deeply ingrained in mainstream electoral politics. We've never had all of those things at once. We've had a Huey Long character. We've had a silver shirts, paramilitary, pro-fascist, pro-Nazi militia. We've had a Charles Lindbergh leading the America First Committee, and we've had members of Congress affiliated with those things. But all of those elements coming together we haven't seen before. That it's strategically disambiguating to recognize what we've had before and what we haven't. But I'll also say tactically, you have to think about the appeal of the authoritarian message. Why do people like it? Why do people fall for it? Why do people want a strongman form of government rather than a small d democratic form of government? And to me, I find it tactically helpful to know that the message is always exactly the same. It's the same thing every decade, every generation, every country. They are always selling the same thing. And once you realize that it's a rerun, and that, sometimes it's an Italian accent, sometimes it's in a German accent, sometimes it has a Queen's accent, I think knowing that this is a shtick.
But you have, I'm sorry, I apologize for trying to tie it to today, but when you have, former chief of staff for Trump, John Kelly, saying, right, talking openly about Trump talking about the loyalty of Hitler's Nazi generals, saying that he thinks that Trump fits into the general definition of a fascist. And the next kind of conversation immediately almost is, does this move the needle, yes or no? Does it change anything at the point that we are in right now?
I don't know. I mean, the reason we always have this, whatever new outrage you're hearing from Trump or the Trump campaign, or the new line, or the new thing he swore about, or the new thing that was revealed by somebody who worked with him in the past. I think part of the reason that there's an expectation that it doesn't, as you say, move the needle is because people like Trump for the transgressive thrill that he gives them. What he is promising is to break everything, to not have a media anymore, and to not have politics anymore, and frankly, to not have political contests of any kind anymore, and to not have a government that has any sort of institutional heft anymore. All that's over. That's all boring. This is just a guy who's going to come in and get stuff done. And isn't that exciting? And in that case, there's no transgression that is too upsetting to turn off people who are energized by his wrongness and his offensiveness. But, I do think it's helpful to say, hey, this was Hitler's shtick too. This was Mussolini's shtick too. And, a nation in decline, we used to be great, but now we've been victimized by some, evil, sick, subhuman group of enemies, and we need extraordinary measures against them, and regular elections, and politics don't work, and violence is noble and purifying. This is the same message from everybody. Are you enjoying it from Trump? You would have enjoyed it in other generations too. I think that makes it boring, which is the opposite of transgressive, and that might be helpful.
This relates to that, I think, which is whether or not it would be helpful either to oppose him or maybe perversely to boost him if the word was used more often. I mean, this has been something in recent weeks, as Yonit said, first Mark Milley, now Kelly, now Kamala Harris herself, Nancy Pelosi the other day saying, yes, fascism is the right word for him. And I wonder if the diffidence, the sort of bashfulness about using that word, was that wise and smart? In a way, based on what you've just said, I'm now not sure it was necessarily a bad thing holding back, because maybe he would like it if you said it about him because of your transgressive point, does he want us to think of the parallel? And to, is he triggering those memories? Because on some level, this word, which we all felt was so taboo, he embraces it.
One of the Steve Bannon speeches that I sort of go back to again and again is a kind of off-the-radar speech that Bannon gave, not even in the United States, he gave it in Europe, in which he talked about how adherents to his ideology and right-wing populists of the type that he was promoting all over the world should embrace the label racist. That if you get called a racist, you should take that as a badge of honor and don't let that slow you down. They're going to call you racist. And actually, J.D. Vance does a version of this, Trump's running mate, where his disastrous first day on the campaign trail after the Republican convention, he did this whole riff about how people call him racist for drinking Diet Mountain Dew. Nobody knew what he was talking about, but he comes from this very online sort of Bannon-esque space where they're trying to say, take the worst things that they can call you and claim them as positive, so that those words are robbed of their approbation. I, in general, try just not to do things that other people want me to do, and try not to have my chain yanked, and I try not to cover things that other people have manipulated me into being outraged about and therefore wanting to cover. I don't care whether or not it bothers him or he likes it that he gets called a fascist. I think it's worth talking about fascism. I don't think name-calling moves anybody. Like the New York Times, I think today, has their headline after John Kelly came out and Mark Milley and Mark Esper, the defense secretary, all came out saying, yeah, we think he wants to rule. We think he is personally a fascist who wants to rule as a fascist dictator. The New York Times headline today was, Kamala Harris calls Trump a fascist. Like, as if it's just an epithet that she's cast at him. And isn't that crazy that she's calling him that? So I don't know. The name itself may or may not mean anything, but I do think that talking about the strongman appeal as being something that's a rerun is maybe more helpful.
If you manage to not be yanked to tell us how to do that, just a general request about life. I'm jealous of you managing not to do that.
Whenever you're planning your show and you're saying, I wish we didn't have to cover this, but take that as your permission to not cover it.
That will echo in my head for a while. What's interesting to me is not only did you manage to, unearth the story of just how many American fascists there were and just how high in the ranks they were, but also the story that is equally important of the good guys that were fighting them, that were standing, against that and managed to, in many ways, succeed. The Leon Lewises, the Joe Rogies, and I wonder, we're talking a lot about the parallels between then and now of quote unquote bad guys of the story. But what about the good guys? Do you see a Leon Lewis today? Do you see a Joe Rogie today when you look at the political landscape or other landscapes?
Thank you for putting it that way and for seeing that. That's absolutely what I think is the most important thing here. None of the heroes in the story of the Great Sedition Trial of 1944 and all of the violent anti-Semitic paramilitary groups and the Americans who were on the Nazi payroll, of whom there were a lot, including a number of members of Congress and senators, none of the people who exposed those people and fought those people and strategized effectively against them is a famous person. With the possible exception of a few journalists who had big names, who exposed them and wrote about them sort of fearlessly, but really they're all lost to history, and I just don't. Those are the people I'm trying to make famous. And so Leon Lewis, as you mentioned, was a World War I veteran. He was a lawyer. He came back to Los Angeles after World War I and realized that the pro-Nazi organizing that was happening in Los Angeles, targeting World War I veterans, targeting German Americans in particular, that was the largest German American population in the U.S., very much paralleled the way that Hitler was building his own movement in Germany. And he started spying on them. He was Jewish, he recruited non-Jewish, German American, mostly World War I veterans to allow themselves to seem to be recruited, but instead to report to Lewis, who then packaged those spy reports and brought them to law enforcement and tried to get law enforcement interested. Most of the time, law enforcement not interested. The few breakthrough moments that he had were really happenstance and a testament to his persistence that he did this work for like a decade. And most of the time, nobody would listen to him. But It turns out there were U.S. Marines who were stealing U.S. military weapons out of an armory in Southern California and had plans to fully raid the armory in San Francisco to provide those weapons to the Silver Shirts and other paramilitary pro-Nazi groups, a plot that was funded in part out of the German consulate in San Francisco. Really dramatic stuff. Finally, he got naval intelligence to pay attention to that because it involved Marines and an armory and because he knew a Jewish officer at Naval Intelligence who was willing to listen to him, even when the FBI and the sheriff's departments and the police departments wouldn't do it. What a hero. There's a guy named Henry Hoke, who was a direct mail advertising expert who recognized that the tide of pro-German, pro-fascist, anti-democratic propaganda in the country was much bigger than anybody recognized, was coordinated from a single source, and seemed to have a sort of kingpin in the United States who had a lot of money to be doing a very professional job. That led to the exposure of lots of members of Congress being on the payroll of the Nazis and taking part in that. So is there a Henry Hoke today? Exactly. I don't know if there's an exact allegory. Is there a Leon Lewis? I don't know if there's an exact allegory. But I want Americans in particular to think about those men's lives as paragons of virtue and as strategically sound models of citizenship when you're up against an authoritarian movement that is violent and is trying to undo the American form of government. I want us to know that that's a way to live too. And so I want to make these guys as famous as I can.
Yeah, no, you've excavated heroes as well as villains with this story. And that's a hugely important contribution. I'm just thinking that Jewish readers of this story will feel, I think, very unnerved to realize the depth of anti-Semitism in America, because the America's place in contemporary Jewish mythology is, the Golden Medina. This is the place we've arrived where at last we're safe and so on. And yet you realize there's anti-Semitism pre-war, during the war, and in your new work, post-war. As you said before, Holocaust denial when the Holocaust is barely a word yet, and it finds traction in America. I think that's very unsettling, I think, for American Jews to think about their beloved country. But it will be especially unsettling now in this last year, which has been a very unnerving year for Jews all over the world. You have charted the anti-Semitism of the right and how it comes at them, high levels, high and low. I wonder if there'll be some readers who think, yeah, that's true, and there's huge lessons to be learned there for now, including there's an American far right still today. Got to pay attention to it. But whether there'll be some who say, but the people who've been making Jewish lives difficult this last year have not been exclusive to the right. And that I'm thinking of students on campuses where, there was famously an individual case, Columbia University, where a student there was then, I think, expelled from the university for saying, all Zionists off, we don't want them here and they're not welcome, etc. Is it sort of easier, in a way, to just focus on the anti-Semitism of the right because it's familiar, we know about it, it's swastikas and jackboots, and much harder, especially for progressives? You work for MSNBC, I work for The Guardian. Is it hard to get our heads around an anti-Jewish sentiment when it comes from, as it were, our side?
Yeah, I had a really interesting long-form interview with Deborah Lipstadt about this exact point. She's the U.S. envoy against global anti-Semitism for the Biden administration. And she talked very eloquently. She's an eloquent person always, but she talked very eloquently about how she'll have conversations with people who are exquisite in their ability to identify, critique, and in some ways dismantle the power of anti-Semitism among people on the opposite side of the ideological number line from them. And they're completely blind to it when it's on their own side.
Right.
And I think she's absolutely right about that. I think that tendency is there. The thing about this story, what I'm doing in Prequel and in Ultra more broadly in those 2 seasons of that podcast, is that it is a story about the right. And the focus on anti-Semitism in that story is to show what a necessary ingredient anti-Semitism is for authoritarian messaging. What people are selling when they're selling fascism specifically, I would say, not just authoritarianism broadly, but fascism specifically, is that there has to be some group of super powerful, subhuman enemies who are both lesser than and also so powerful they control us all. And that's why we can't have politics anymore. Because if we do anything that looks like normal politics, that evil cabal will wire politics for their own purposes and will never get around them. And ultimately, they're here to destroy us. And that it's just absolutely central to the idea of victimhood and grievance and the need for, racially defined nation and the need for violence and the need to get rid of democracy. It's structurally key.
I will just connect to what Jonathan talked about and asked, was there anything in this year where we saw, again, American Jews hit by this huge, not only American, European as well, but this huge tsunami of anti-Semitism that surprised you, the volume of it?
All of it surprised me. I mean, I just felt like we left the timeline. We left what we thought was the arc of our lives in these decades. And all of a sudden, we are in a different place. And all the dynamics are different, and everybody's at risk. Looking at a member of the Italian parliament who's a Holocaust survivor who now needs 24-hour armed guard as she travels around the country, meets her constituents and is doing parliamentary work, but also talking about anti-Semitism, talking about surviving Auschwitz. And she needs, as a member of parliament, she needs an armed guard. I think it's been like a moral bucket of cold water for a lot of us who thought we were in a different place.
I'm thinking back to what you said about how the role it plays in any authoritarian project. And I'm realizing that that's something that can apply to the left as well as the right.
Absolutely.
Because you just have it on your new season. You've got this really interesting thing about the guy who writes a kind of American Mein Kampf, and he likes the Soviet Union for its anti-Semitism. But I mean, even now, you will get figures on the extreme left who I think will say that we can't have normal politics because the discourse is controlled by Zionist media ownership or whatever. You will get echoes of that. I want to ask you just something about your audience, which I imagine, you'll tell me if I'm wrong, but your MSNBC audience would skew younger, progressive, that audience, because it was reported a lot when it was Biden that he was losing those people over Gaza, that body of voters. Then it was a change at the top. You heard it much less about Kamala Harris in the way they were disaffected from Biden. What's your read of where those people are now that it's Kamala Harris, not Biden, but the war is still going on?
I think it's very hard to tell. I feel like the punditocracy on this is pretty distant from voter behavior. And for most American voters, I would say, they think precisely not at all about anything outside of the United States. And for Americans who are focused on Israel and Gaza and Hamas and Lebanon and Hezbollah and Iran and all, for Americans who are thinking about those things, they're incredibly motivated by those in their voting behavior. But how does that voting behavior map? I mean, some of the anti-Semitic protests that you're talking about coming from the left have targeted Kamala Harris, right? There's former President Trump inviting Kanye West, who wants to go DEFCON 3 on Jewish people, and Nick Fuentes, who wants to finish the job that Hitler started, inviting them to dinner, never apologizing for it. And yet claiming that Kamala Harris is the one who has an anti-Semitism problem, which she must be obviously tempted to have her Jewish husband respond to many of those attacks. So there's a lot of energy around it among people for whom those are the issues that are going to motivate their vote. But where those votes land, I think, is a very complicated map, because the anger, I think, with the Biden administration, the Biden-Harris administration, in terms of the way they've handled this thing, I think kind of cancels itself out in terms of people who are angry at them from one side and people who are angry at them from the other. And Trump's outrageous pronouncements and associations and I think policy commitments on the issue, I think, could equally drive people both ways. So I think it's incredibly hard to predict what this is going to result in, but it hasn't stopped there from being many 50-gallon drums of ink spilled on it in the meantime.
In your book, there's a lot about Henry Ford, and of course him being a vile anti-Semite, and having this voice. And then I remember that's Dearborn, Michigan, yet again, right? It all connects to a completely different scenario. But do you have an assessment on what kind of president each of them would be when it comes to the Middle East, when it comes to Israel? How different will they be from each other?
I think they'd be pretty profoundly different. I mean, I think that the worldwide impact of a Trump presidency is underappreciated in the United States. And that's mostly because I think most voters don't have the world in mind when we think about our voting choices. But if you sort of, in its totality, if you put together what Trump is, if not promising, sort of indicating the kind of course he'll pursue, it's a radically different world with America having a radically different role in it. And so it's the United States out of NATO, which effectively, that's kind of it for NATO. The Russian invasion of Ukraine becomes a template in terms of what you can expect in that world, in the immediate wake of Trump destroying NATO. I mean, I think it's lights out Ukraine. I think it's probably lights out Taiwan. But I also think it's a world largely led then by the big dictatorships, by Russia and by China, with the United States. For lack of a better analogy, with the United States on the Axis side, not the Allied side, and that's a radically, radically different world economically. It's a radically different world in terms of security. I mean, I don't know how many Americans are thinking about Moldova right now, or Georgia, or even Poland. But the world 4 years from now, if Trump's back in office, will just be a profoundly different world. And the idea that the American president is the leader of the free world will be a laugh line.
It's so terrifying what you're saying there. And then a kind of second order of terror to me is the fact that half the American people are not terrified by the prospect you've just set out. The idea, I mean, when you just said that, Axis not allied, that sends a kind of shiver through me, a tremor through me. And I don't think it's hyperbolic for you to say it. I understand exactly why you're saying it. But the shock I have is that, all the evidence, it's back to our discussion in a way about fascism. All the evidence is there. You've got now people who knew him better than anyone saying he liked Hitler, he thinks like a fascist, I was his chief of staff. You've got a world that is very clear what he does in your examples about Ukraine and Taiwan. And yet you've got half the American people just saying, okay, that's all right, that's fine. They're not frightened of it. And I think about the periods you've analysed, I don't think it rose to the level of half the country who you could put in that category. This goes back to your point about there wasn't a single national figure that we can measure. The glass is suddenly looking half empty, rather. In
1940, for example, 83% of in 1940, right? So think about what's already going on between Britain and Germany, just say. And by 1940, 83% of the American people did not want us to be involved in World War II. And then, it took us getting hit at Pearl Harbor before that all turned around. But it was a massive, massive, massive majority against the idea that the United States should play a role in that military conflict on the side of the Allies. And then the biggest anti-war organization that the United States has ever known to this day believed that if we should get into that war, then we should ally with the other side because Germany's victory was inevitable. So, while we had the America First Committee, the biggest voluntary political organization of its time. We had the most famous person in America, who wasn't the president, Charles Lindbergh. We had the biggest industrialist in the country, Henry Ford. We had the biggest media figure of all time in American history, Charles Coughlin. When we had them all to a great, across the gradation of them. Lindbergh is saying aviation is God's gift to the white race, and we need to use it to subjugate the colored people of the world. Coughlin is saying, I take the road of fascism. Henry Ford is circulating in a dozen languages, the international Jew, the world's problem. This is very, very, very radical stuff. And most of the country agrees, not necessarily with those extreme elements of what they're proposing, but generally with what they're asking for this country. And that is happening while Hitler is knocking off one country after another in Europe. And that is really bad odds. And that makes it look really bad for what the United States is going to do. And through the leadership of Franklin Delano Roosevelt and through the leadership of a lot of forgotten citizen heroes and through the leadership of some very stubborn, very not career-minded, aggressive prosecutors at the Justice Department. I think the darkest heart and the most violent heart of that movement in the United States was ripped out, and we as a country took an anti-fascist stand at a time when it seemed absolutely impossible that that's where it would go.
You did
I'm
make us
filling
feel
up
a
the
little
glass.
better.
The glass is filling. It's not working. I can tell.
No, it is, absolutely.
A little.
No, I'm encouraged.
When you're thirsty, everything works. I was wondering, because you were talking about leadership, and I wonder, just to cross the aisle for a moment, if you, in this really unprecedented election, do you feel like you know enough about the Democratic nominee, about Kamala Harris?
I'm from San Francisco. My parents still live in the house that I grew up in the Bay Area, actually in Alameda County, which is where she started as a prosecutor, as among other things, a sex crimes prosecutor. I remember her being elected DA of San Francisco. Here's a story idea. This will become particularly a juicy story idea for you if she does get elected president. Go back and look at the first election she ever won, which was her DA election, district attorney election in San Francisco. And just look at the bio of the guy who she beat. She beat this guy named Vincent Hallinan, who growing up in San Francisco was not just larger than life. I mean, he mocked the size of life itself. He was the most dominant character you can possibly imagine in San Francisco politics, and crazy as a loon. And she was the sane person who knocked him off, which was, and I was there for that. So I was there for her in California for her election as attorney general and her election as senator. And so I feel like I've known a lot about her maturation as a politician. Her sister went to high school with my brother. She just happens to be a person who I've got a lot of connections to. And so I feel confident that I know who she is and how she'd govern. I don't know whether or not she's going to win this race, though.
Well, I mean, that's the thing that no one wants to talk about in a way in our business, because we've all been burnt by predictions. Yeah. But Nate Silver wrote something the other day saying, don't listen to anyone's gut instinct, but my gut instinct is that Trump is going to win. And, he triggered a round of kind of Democratic angst and nail chomping the minute he said that. Do you have a gut instinct? And if you have it, would you tell us what it is?
My gut instinct. I mean, Nate said, "Don't trust anybody's gut instinct" as a faux modesty thing. He wants you to trust his gut instinct. I do not want you to trust mine. I am always wrong. My gut lives on another planet. My gut was completely convinced we were going to have President McCain in 2008 and then President Romney in 2012. Like, confident. I can tell you that I can read polls, and the polls say it's a tie. So if you care about how this election works, the only thing to do is not to stare harder at the polls, but rather go knock on doors or call people in swing states. Like this, there's still time to work to achieve the outcome that you want. And there's nothing about doom scrolling through social media or looking at polls that's going to make anything happen. You have to make something happen by actually getting out into real life.
We know you're very busy, and we want the conversation to last for another 2 hours. But I do wonder, after, researching this at length for many years, is this two questions, actually. Is there more here in this story that you want to keep pursuing? As you said, you started it from the angle of Holocaust denial, and it turned into this huge, can of worms about fascism in America. Is there more to this that you would want to pursue? And if not, what's next on the agenda?
There's more. There's more to pursue for sure. I mean, there's a few different things that I've sort of been working on in terms of what I'm going to do next. I've got a book project that I'm working on now, which is not a historical book project. It's very recent history. It's about sort of inspired by Prequel, actually. It's about the Justice Department not being all that. The Justice Department has a mythology that comes from a very earnest place about how they are never politicized and how they're a professional institution, and American law enforcement and American politics. There's a great Chinese wall between them, and the failures of the Justice Department to protect itself against political maneuvering is something that is, I think, really important for us to get real about and stop telling ourselves the happy story about. So I'm working on that a little bit, which may or may not end up being a book, but I'm working on that. I also really think that the other thing, just as in 2017, I was distressed by the resurgence of Holocaust denial, and we've seen that have a great, 10-year run or 5-year run since 8-year run now. Never do math live on a podcast. But the other thing that I'm really seeing right now that I am that I think is still like a little bit more fringe, but I can see it getting mainstream very fast, is scientific racism. The idea that you've got, your calipers that can tell you by measuring somebody's head whether or not they're a subgenus of human that has a low IQ, and all of this like IQ talk among the right now, I think is very not good and has a recent history in the United States that I think a lot of people don't know. I think the scientific racism stuff is particularly because Trump himself is talking about the racehorse theory, which is this idea, essentially a eugenics idea about breeding for intelligence and breeding out the criminals and all this stuff. That stuff has a backstory that Americans need to know about ourselves, not just about how this functioned in other countries. And so I'm working on that too. So I got a lot of stuff. None of it's happy.
Yeah, I was going to say, it's not super cheery, the projects you're in. But on a positive note, I think there's Ultra the movie is surely in the pipeline somewhere, isn't it? You should tell us about that.
So, Tony Kushner, who is the smartest person in American public life, and Danny Strong, who's an amazing screenwriter. The two of them are collaborating on the screenplay for Ultra, which is the core story of Prequel, the book as well. They're collaborating on that screenplay for Steven Spielberg to produce and direct. So that is in the works, and it's pinch me. I can't believe that's real. We're still developing Bagman, which is a story that I did about the prosecution of Nixon's vice president, Spiro Agnew. That
who literally had cash in a bag.
Literally cash in the bag in the White House.
Yeah.
40-count felony indictment that caused him to resign from the vice presidency. And then he went on to become an international anti-Semite for hire. The Saudis put him on the salary to go spread anti-Semitic bile against American Jews. That was a nice post-vice presidential career for him. That project is in development with Ben Stiller, which I'm really, really proud about. And I got a million of them, you guys. I got a million. And they're all glass half full somewhere along the way. I swear.
So the glass half full is actually that life is never boring. And that
life is at least never without work to do.
Exactly. And that maybe Joe Rogan and Leon Lewis will be played by Matt Damon and, Ben Affleck. So
your lips to God's ears, Yonit. Your lips to God's ears.
Rachel Maddow, thank you so much for coming back to us on Unholy.
I just really could not enjoy talking to you guys more than I do, and ask me back sooner than the cadence that we had for the last time. I think you do such great work, the two of you, and I love this podcast, and long may you wave.
We'll have you back.
Thank you so much. We really
Thank you
appreciate
very,
that.
very much. Well, it's a huge pleasure to have a conversation with Rachel Maddow, and we're very, very touched by what she said about coming on Unholy. But she's really doing something tremendously important, excavating this history, which I don't think was widely known at all. I think people vaguely knew that America First didn't want to go into the war in the late 30s, early 40s, but to dive down deep into the American past and show Americans now that kind of fascism, authoritarianism, strongmanism, they have a real history with that. It's not something that just happened abroad, which is, I think, the myth they like to tell themselves. It was right there. And you feel it was almost just luck and a kind of blessing that they swerved away from it, because they were right heading towards it. This new series of the podcast she does, Ultra, about Joe McCarthy, etc., I think, again, it will be shocking to people to realise how much some of the things that are going on now were there. This huge, larger-than-life character just telling lies all the time on the media, dominating the news cycle. Been there,
Yeah, first of all, the book and the podcast, as you say, tell a story that was unknown, because the stories we tell ourselves, and particularly that Americans tell themselves, right, we were heroes, we were on the right side. Well, it's more complicated than that. And there are a lot of people that it's shocking, but it's important to know there were people who sided with the bad guys. But also the fact that I think she elegantly doesn't hit this point on the head. right? It's not that she says, and we kind of tried to pull her that way a lot in the conversation and the parallels between then and now. Of course, it echoes, a lot of it echoes, but she doesn't say to you, yes, Trump is that politician from the 1940s and someone else is, the comparisons are not done bluntly. They're done elegantly. And to me, I think what was also striking in this conversation was the candor around the anti-Semitism coming from the left that we have seen this year, right? After, of course, she analyzes meticulously and adroitly the roots of anti-Semitism from the right and fascism in America. And she says quite beautifully that you can have a strong man or a fascist without, going against the Jews, that is kind of a prerequisite. But also when she says to you, right, she quotes that conversation with Deborah Lipstadt, the special envoy to combat anti-Semitism, right, that you always know how to analyze the anti-Semitism of the other side of your political affiliation, which I found extremely interesting as well. And finally, that telling the story of the unknown heroes, which I found really important. And in a way, that is what, Lin-Manuel Miranda did with Hamilton. That is what you, sir, did with the escape artist and Rudy Verba. And that is what she does with Joe Rogan, particularly with Leon Lewis. These people who stood against the odds and were completely forgotten by history and stood against this evil. And I think that is something that's really important in what she did.
Completely agree. I noticed the candor too, and I noticed at one point she did describe, not allegedly, not what some people say, she said those anti-Semitic protests this last year coming from the left, and there was no ifs or buts. She accepted that frame, and I think that was important, partly for the reason that I sort of said, that she is a figure on the progressive left. She is iconic for a lot of those people. That's her audience. So I thought that was really important. She said that to us, and I was very, I noted it. Without over-flattering her, she is herself in that tradition of people who stood up against the rising tide that was sweeping other people away. I mean, I think so. She mentions, these past figures who were exposing fascism in America in the 40s. And, and we admire them for, you were the one who brought it out. There are quite a few journalists doing that now, but she's definitely one of them. And I think that's very, very important. She's been doing it a long time. On her show, I think it is very sobering what she says about what a second Trump presidency would mean. I think that framing of Axis and Allied, as I said, it sends a sort of shiver down my spine, that thought. So really good to talk to Rachel Maddow, and the book is Prequel, out now once again, and we're glad to have had her on. So we get to our awards, and because I have one foot out of the door, because I am flying off to the US literally as soon as we have finished this recording, I'm going to let you do the heavy lifting here and hand out both baubles and gongs for this week's awards season.
Always a gentleman, Mr. Friedland. Okay, so I will start with our Chutzpah Awards. Always better to start with that and end on a high note with the mensch. So, very brief Chutzpah Award. We mentioned the Knesset was in recess, the Israeli parliament in recess for 3 months. It is back. I think the deserved winner of this award is David Bitan, a member of Knesset from the Likud, who sat in front of the hostages' families who are, growing increasingly desperate. One of them is a relative of Carmel Gat. She is one of those Israelis who was executed by Hamas. And she was talking about the dire situation the hostages were in. And he looked at her and said, "Could you please be brief?" I mean, if that is, I don't know, that's way beyond chutzpah. That's just terribly rude. But I think he deserves it for that, by the way, making a lot of headlines in Israel, that terrible behavior of his. But it is indicative of parts of the coalition and the way they have been, I think, treating hostages' families. I think Rachel Goldberg, Hirsch Goldberg's mother, whose interview we brought on this podcast related to that as well. He was murdered with Carmel Gat. Our Mensch Award of the week, we choose to give to Rachel Goldberg. She is the newly widowed wife of Avi Goldberg. He was killed in Lebanon. They are together parents of 8 children. And the reason I think she deserves the Mensch Award of this week, 2 things really. We talked about that rift between the religious Zionism and the Haredim. They come from the religious Zionism community. He, in fact, was a teacher in a very important school in Jerusalem called Himmelfarb of that community. And she gave an interview on our Channel 12, and she said, I just don't understand why the Haredim, our brothers, do not realize we are in a situation where they have to carry the burden as well. And the other thing that we should say about this very unique family, Avi Goldberg, according to all accounts, tried throughout his life to bring sort of unity to Israeli society. They said, listen, we will accept politicians in our Shiva while mourning for our father, but you will have to come in pairs. We want to see politicians who come, one representative from the opposition and one from the coalition. Only that way we will accept politicians. Victor Lieberman, of course, a prominent part of the opposition, wrote on Twitter that he went to console them together with Miki Zohar, who's a minister from the Likud. So that I thought was also a point, I've never heard that before, in which a family says, you know what, we're okay with politicians coming. Some families aren't, by the way, definitely in this climate in Israel, but we want you to come together. And that is, I think, a beautiful thing, and that's why I wanted to mention that. Yeah,
I think that's a very worthy winner of our Mensch Award, and a brilliant idea, actually, the going in pairs. And I can see that. I can imagine people picking up on that and copying that elsewhere in other contexts around the world. We are going to be very much present on social media with clips and so on of some of our interviews. You can see those. They come often a bit early ahead of the interview itself. So do follow us on Instagram at Unholy Podcast, the same on Facebook. You can follow us there. It just remains to say our thank yous.
And to say we also have a Substack account and we're on YouTube. What's the matter with you, man? We will say our thank yous to Michal Porat. And we indeed will talk next week. There will be a lot to talk about. Safe travels to the U.S., Jonathan. We'll see.
Thank you.
We'll
very
see
much
each other next week.
We will. See you then.